First, though, Russia has fired a big new wave of missiles across Ukraine today, killing at least 6 civilians, knocking out power in places. The government in Kiev said the latest attacks involved hypersonic cruise missiles, one of Moscow's most valuable weapons. Many targets were far from the front, so today marked a return to a Russian air campaign against civilian infrastructure not seen since mid-February. It briefly forced Europe's biggest nuclear power plant off the grid. More on that very soon. First to Kiev, where Denis Ganja lives. He described a night of continuous bombardment.
The air alarm started at 1 a.m. and of course we all went to the shelters to protect ourselves. And it lasted for 5 hours. But the biggest explosion, which woke up all the Kiev, was at 5:50. Russia used the very high and very speedy Kinjal missile, which is really, there is no chance Ukrainian anti-missile systems can get it. Fortunately, in Kiev, there are no power cuts. But for instance, my family who stays in Kharkiv region, they have not had the electricity for nearly the whole morning. There are also problems with water. But for now, what the mayor said, 70% of the Kharkiv region is back with electricity. So Russians have spent more than $500 million just for nothing.
The head of the UN's nuclear watchdog today demanded immediate action to prevent a disaster at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. Rafael Grossi's remarks came after renewed shelling cut its only remaining power line, which provides electricity for essential cooling of radioactive material. He spoke earlier to the BBC's Geeta Gurumurthy.
This proves again how fragile, how terribly dangerous this situation is at Zaporizhzhia. The idea is to avoid this by establishing a commitment on both sides on something which is very simple. And I think the audience will understand it very, very easily. Don't shoot at a nuclear power plant.
Can you spell out the risks here and how long that backup cooling system can work whilst the power line is restored?
The emergency systems which do exist can operate for a few days, maybe 10 days or something. Of course, depending on the availability of fuel to make them run. These are emergency generators like the ones that you can have in a private house or in a normal installation anywhere. But here, as I want to repeat here, we're talking about 6 nuclear power reactors, the biggest nuclear site in Europe. And I said today to the Board of Governors of the IAEA, we are rolling a dice here. And there will be a day when our luck will run out.
That was Rafael Grossi, the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog. Power has now been restored to that plant. Leon Cizel is a professor of nuclear engineering at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. He's also president of the European Nuclear Society. I asked him how likely an incident was at Zaporizhzhia.
I believe the risk is now even lower than it was in August in the last round of shelling. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant actually didn't operate since August. So these reactors tend to cool down with time, and without operation in the last 6 months, the situation is much more manageable than it was in the first week after the operation in August.
But you can't shut a plant down fully, can you? And it needs electricity to be in a sort of reduced state of operation.
Yes, that's correct. The fuel which is in the reactor needs cooling, continuous cooling for about 5 years or something like that. The situation 6 months later is much, much more manageable than it was in August. And I was also pretty convinced also in August that the situation was not really critical there.
So you think that today's warning from the UN is over the top?
Not really. If we look at the technical part of the story, technically this is manageable. Now, if you look from the human part of the story, the Ukrainian staff that is under Russian military pressure on the site for about 1 year, not knowing exactly who is the master and what to do. And this is probably the most serious risk to be considered. And then all the talks which might bring the pressure away from these people there at the site would help immensely. I believe Mr. Grossi is doing a great work there.
The International Atomic Energy Agency is present at all 4 of Ukraine's nuclear power plants, isn't it? What are they doing there?
they are technically able people who are able to get independent view on the operation and risks at these power plants. And they are able to transmit this information to the headquarters of the agency without really talking to either of the sides involved there, Russians or Ukrainians. So they are our link to the as real information or as realistic information as possible. They don't really have any particular power. We should be clear about that. They are just observers.
Can we talk about the possibility of a nuclear reactor coming under direct fire? How hard are they to hit, to cause an accident deliberately?
Well, that would require a really serious and very focused military attack. But also, the reactors are very well protected, not because of the possible war situation, but there is a lot of concrete around the reactors as a shield of radiation. It's there to protect the personnel in the nuclear power plants. It looks like a military bunker, to go through this with the weapons. It really needs a deliberate and very strong attack. Random shelling will probably not do much damage.
Ukraine is very reliant as a nation on nuclear power, isn't it? With Zaporizhzhia running at very low levels. We've talked today about the renewed attacks on civilian infrastructure. Energy supplies taken a huge hit in this war.
Yes, but also we should be fair to say that we are listening to these attacks to the civilian energy infrastructures in the last weeks, if not months. We actually never heard about any attack on the nuclear power plant in the last few months. And also today, that was not really the attack to the nuclear power plant. It was attack to the last power line going to the nuclear power plant. They are destroying the power lines, they are destroying other power facilities, but actually not the nuclear power plants.
That was Professor Leon Cizel from the University of Ljubljana. Now, there have been fresh anti-government protests today in Georgia. Popular anger shows no sign of cooling, despite Georgia's ruling party's promise to drop a foreign agents law reminiscent of Russian legislation. Concerns have been mounting that the former Soviet country, which aspires to join the EU and NATO, is taking an authoritarian turn and strengthening its links with Moscow. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, Georgia has hosted an influx of anti-war Russians. But in recent weeks, the authorities have barred some Kremlin critics from entering the country. Armaz Akhvladiani is an independent opposition member of parliament and a former Secretary-General of the ruling Georgian Dream Party. He spoke to my NewsHour colleague James Menendez and gave his reaction to news that the government was agreeing to withdraw its foreign agents legislation.
First of all, I would like to say that it is victory of Georgian people, of course, because of European way, European future is part of our values. But we have to understand that in Georgia we have today the Russian dream, the government party which is Russian dream because of its totally Russian interests against democracy and rule of law. And concretely, it is about next year parliamentary elections, and our ruling party is going to do everything to keep the power, to keep the influence on whole country. And oligarch Ivanishvili is a formal leader of the political system in the country, the ruling party. So he has concrete Russian interests and is trying to realize all these interests.
Yes,
unfortunately,
and I want to ask you a bit more about him in a minute. But I mean, is that why you left the party? Because you saw them as being too pro-Russia?
It was some 8 years ago. My main goal was to make the ruling party in Georgia a democratic party, European-style party. But unfortunately, I can say now that I was alone and among the old political crocodiles, and it was practically impossible to start the process of democratization in the party. I told to Prime Minister Ivanishvili, by that time, Prime Minister Ivanishvili, that only way for Georgia to be a normal European-style country is to step by step to start the process of democratization inside of ruling party, which will have the direct influence to the whole political process in the country.
It is the oligarch, the billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, who, as you say, was prime minister back in 2012. I mean, is he pulling the strings in Georgia? Is that what you're saying?
It's clear for me that he's still trying to do his best to keep all kind of influence, all ministers in the government, including the prime minister, all members of the majority in the parliament, they are under his control. And he's trying to keep the power, not just during next parliamentary elections next year, but I guess his plan is to stay as long as it is possible.
And can I just, sorry to interrupt you, we're nearly out of time. Can I just ask you this? I mean, it seems a strange platform to stand on to be close to Russia when we're told that the vast majority of Georgians want to be part of the European Union.
Absolutely. And that is why government today decided to stop this stupid Russian law, because they know that most of the people in Georgia, they are protesting. And what is important now, the young generation, the students, youth, they are, I may say, the main force, democratic force in our country.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to recognize that China has its eyes on everything we do and on our people. I'm one of those that's concerned about my personal privacy. I don't want our government following everything I do. I particularly don't want the Chinese Communist Party being able to follow everything I do and that everybody in our country does. And that's, of course, related to TikTok, but it relates to other things as well. And so the bill that we have proposed provides the Secretary of Commerce the capacity to limit or to put tariffs on or actually to deny certain products from coming into our country if they determine that they represent a threat to our national security. And it would include potentially TikTok, but it could include many other things as well. I read just a couple of days ago that the Chinese are putting cranes in our ports that are able to spy on our ships and what we receive and what we send, including our military ships. These things are important, and we need to make sure that we have adjusted them in such a way that they don't put us at risk.
Yeah, I think that's so vital, and obviously coming together with a large bipartisan group, a rarity in Washington these days, sadly. But one of the things that I noticed in the bill that you alluded to that I wanted to just drill down on for a second, and that is, as you talk about whether it's TikTok, an app, or whether it's a crane, or whether it's a chip or part of an iPhone, all of those things that could impact critical infrastructure or integral telecommunications products, all of those things would be included in this oversight or this authority under the Secretary of Commerce. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. I think we have to recognize that in this modern era, a nation is potentially able to take out the infrastructure of another nation simply with the push of a button. And so what we don't want to do is put ourselves in a position of vulnerability to a nation, whether it's Russia or China or Iran or North Korea, that would have the capacity to say, okay, we're turning off America's electricity or its water until you give us X, Y, and Z. That's just not acceptable, and we have to recognize that and make sure that as we are letting the Chinese and others invest in our country and send products to our country and applications to our country, that we're not making ourselves more vulnerable to malevolent acts on their part.
One of the things that is included in the proposed piece of legislation is an education process in terms of the public and the business community. And I think this is an interesting area. Obviously, you have a lot of young people as it relates to TikTok who might shrug their shoulders and say, we're going to use it anyway. You have others who say, wait a minute, that's going to limit free speech. And so then that becomes problematic. How do you see navigating that part of the program?
Well, there's no question that we want people to feel the capacity to communicate what they believe freely. There are all sorts of apps. I don't have to tell you that or your listeners. There are thousands upon thousands of apps, but we want to make sure that if a communist China party is able to control or oversee the information that we're receiving or censor the things that Americans are saying, that would be unacceptable. And so their systems would have to be detached from the capacity of the Chinese Communist Party to either spy on us or to propagandize us or to censor our citizens from expressing their views.
So important. And as you pointed out at the beginning there, Senator, one thing to be very upset and worried about our own country spying on us, but if it's the Chinese Communist Party or their businesses, and we should note that there really aren't private businesses in China, the government's controlling those.
Yeah, each business in China, in order to become a legitimate business in China, has to cede to the Communist Chinese Party all information and technology that they might develop. So they are, if you will, all instruments in the hands of a very powerful Chinese government.
Yeah, and let's shift to another area of concern as we talk about Russia and their continued pursuit in Ukraine. You had an opinion piece over the weekend talking about what we need to do and what we need to be wary of. You have sounded the alarm on Vladimir Putin and Russia, and people, I think, are finally hearing that call. And where are we as it relates to that? What should we be doing as it relates to Ukraine, and where do you think Vladimir Putin is in terms of what he's trying to do next?
Well, Vladimir Putin's in kind of a tough spot. His country is shrinking in terms of its population. Its GDP is small. It really can't be competitive with either the United States or China. So he wants to grab more territory, more population, more industry. So he wants to invade other countries and grab what they have. And Ukraine is pushing back against that. The Ukrainians are fighting this war on their own. We agreed in 1994 that we would assure their sovereignty as a nation. We did that as an agreement for them to give up their nuclear weapons, which they did. So we have an obligation, and we're meeting that obligation, I believe, by providing them with the weapons to fight the war themselves. They will pursue that as they feel appropriate, but it's very much in our interest, in the interest of communicating to our friends around the world that we stand by our word, that we continue to provide them the armament they need. And just by the way, we spend about $800 billion a year on our military. The portion that we're providing to Ukraine is about 5% of that number. So I believe it is money very well spent.
Derek Overstreet here from the New Millennium Group. Listen, what I'm hearing a lot of is that folks would love to have an income plan that is specially made just for them, that provides an income stream that they cannot outlive as long as they're living. If you'd like a copy of one, give me a call at 888-999-6370. That's 888-999-6370 or utahsfinancialplanner.com. We're standing by right now.
Are tuning into this. We often talk about NATO and, attack on one is attack on all, but Ukraine's not a member of NATO. But you bring back this really important thing in terms of nuclear weapons in 1994 as an incentive and our promises there, and just how important those are, not just to Ukraine, but to other places like Taiwan and other allies around the world to really question, is America really going to be with us when it's really tough?
Well, as you point out, we have made commitments to other nations, certainly through NATO, but also in the Pacific, whether it's Japan or South Korea and others. Our commitments are not the same for all these nations, but those nations are all watching to see whether we honor our word or we do not. And if they determine that we're just going to walk away from Ukraine, not only are we not fighting with them, we don't have soldiers there, we're not shedding blood in Ukraine, but we're providing them with the weapons they need to fight their own war. If they see us walking away even from that, they would completely lose confidence in any agreement we would sign with them. And by the way, we'd lose ultimately a lot of friends and allies and find ourselves standing alone perhaps at a time when it's extraordinarily valuable to have friends.
Yeah, that uncertainty is the enemy in so many cases, not just relating to military, but into a host of other things, including economics. I also wanted to ask you one other thing relating to that, Senator, and that is that some people have said, we've been doing this in kind of dribs and drabs in terms of what we've been delivering to Ukraine. Is it time to be a little more forward-leaning so that they're not getting kind of just in time or just a little late when it comes to those critical resources they need to combat Russia?
I wish I were more of a military strategist to be able to precisely answer that. I do know that a number of my colleagues who have extensive military background, like Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, are very critical and feel that the president has slow-rolled our weapons support to Ukraine. And that may well be right. The president has been a little late in providing the weaponry that Ukraine needs. Now, I recognize that the United States doesn't want to confront Russia in such a way that we get drawn into the war. That would be something we do not want to have happen. But nonetheless, I wish we were a little more forward-leaning and giving Ukraine a stronger hand and more able to push back against the Russians and to get them out of their country.
Yeah, and as you look at this from a slightly broader context in terms of China and Russia, give me a sense from you and from your colleagues what you've been doing on the committee there as it relates to how these things are all interconnected and what we should be most careful of or most concerned about as it relates to U.S. national security.
Well, no question but that the greatest threat to our national security over this century is that China is becoming a superpower and intends to far surpass us with a stronger military. Their navy is already bigger than ours. They have weaponry, rocket weaponry, hypersonics that we don't have yet. So they're a military threat, and we need to make sure that we stand up against the aggressiveness potentially that comes from a very powerful China. One of the reasons we want to be strong is to prevent China or anyone else testing us and coming against us anywhere, or our friends. And so we don't want to have these weapons in order to go to war. We want to have the weapons to keep from going to war. And I don't think there's anything China is watching more closely than whether we're able to stand our ground by providing weaponry to Ukraine when it needs it. If Russia were able just to run over Ukraine and we were to run and hide and cease providing them weaponry, that would be the quickest signal that China had ever received to go ahead and invade others of its neighbors.